G'day to everyone joining us. My name's Alistair Mitchell. I'm the Commercial Director here at Commtract. Really excited to host this webinar today. It's something, someone who worked in public sector and now working in a startup, I get asked a bit, which is what's the difference between the two, and how do you make those transitions happen? And so I wanted to get two people who've done it, and both Nicole and Felicity have done those transitions between public and private sector. I think between the two of you several times over, right? You've been back and forward a couple of times. So really wanted to have that discussion today, and we've had a fantastic level of interest in people joining the webinar. So thank you to everyone for joining. Just a bit of my background. I started off in big corporates and got offered the opportunity to join a political office. And at the time I thought that would be something fun to do for 12 months and ended up doing it for 13 and a half years. And then went back into starting my own business actually, and went into smaller startup sort of areas. And only just at the end of last year came on board with Commtract as their commercial director. For those of you who don't know or maybe less familiar with Commtract, we're a marketplace platform for talent, and we specialize in comms and marketing roles. And what we do is we pre-vet everyone to get on our platform so that we can give people really fast turnaround in meeting their talent needs. And we do that for freelance contracts, short-term contracts, 3, 6, 9, 12-month contracts, and also full-time placements. So we've got just over 4,000 experts on the platform, and we place those across those 3 roles. So I thought I'd start off with each of Felicity and Nick giving us a little bit of an intro to them and their career. And Felicity, if it's all right, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. It's weird speaking into it. I can't see any of you, but it's really good to be here today. And when I saw that Nick was also on it, I thought that's both very interesting, and also we're both ex-police media, so it'll be very sharp, very direct question and answers. Anything you want, we'll probably tell you exactly what we think. So should be a good session. So my background, I worked straight out of uni, I worked in banking for years and years, went over to London, did the same, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was great. I almost went down the pathway of compliance, which now to me seems hilarious, but had touched on comms elements in there. But once I realized that's what I really wanted to do, I was looking around, and I was working for a Japanese bank when 9/11 happened, and the program that I was working on completely shut down. They went back to Tokyo. And so I went to my recruitment agent and says, I need a job. I need to pay my rent, and they said, oh, you can work at the Met. And I said, what's the Met? And they said, that's the police. I went, I don't think so. And they said, they'll pay you the same money. I went, okay, I'm there. Needs must in your mid-20s. So I started working at the Metropolitan Police in London, and similar to what Alistair said, I ended up with being there for 8 years or something, and absolutely loved it, and really cut my teeth there on issues management, obviously crisis management, and it's the best learning I could have ever had, regardless of sector. It really set me up for life in issues management, so I'm eternally grateful. Left there, went into UK government, working under the Conservative government under Theresa May, and then I was with Labor for about 3 weeks. I was in the department, and then Conservatives came in, so it was interesting seeing that transition of government, and then had a baby, so had some time out, worked as a consultant in the Middle East briefly, came back, and where did I go? I worked for a trade union, interestingly. So what you can probably tell from my career path is I am actually politically agnostic. I am more interested in experience and exposure than I am to any one sort of opinion or position. And so I wanted to do that, so I headed up comms for that. That was a real opener and really tough, actually, but a great, again, all learning, all great learning. Moved out to Australia, and back to Australia rather. I'm from Sydney, and worked for Serco, which was a great hybrid because they are a private company, an international company, but their whole premise is actually delivering government services, so winning contracts, bids, etc. Which again, very interesting, but a great entree back into the Australian market. From there, I worked briefly at Westpac in BT Financial Group. Again, really interesting insight into how the private sector works with government and speaks to government, particularly about key issues like superannuation, insurance, etc. And then a bit more consulting after that, and then into New South Wales government, and then to NBN. So I feel like I've hit off all the federal, state, service companies, etc. Yeah, so that's how I find myself where I am now.
Awesome. Thanks, Felicity. And Nick, if you want to give us a little intro about your career.
Yeah, let me try and summarise it. I wasn't quite as wild and wacky and thought about compliance as Felicity, but I did have some interesting trajectories in my career. So I actually started off as a journalist in regional newspapers, so where I grew up actually, and started there as in a cadetship, and then moved into radio and television. So this was all regional for a number of years. And I loved doing that, but I felt that maybe I was slightly ahead of my times. I wasn't quite sure where I was going in media land, and I could see it sort of changing and evolving. So I decided that I wanted to do something different, and got the opportunity to work for Victoria Police as a media advisor. And a bit like Felicity, it's absolutely where I cut my teeth in issues, crisis management, and you know, there was a lot of it, and it was a really interesting time. But I look back on that also fondly as really setting me up as in terms of my career. So I did that for 5 years, and then I feel like I'm sort of chasing Felicity a little bit, because we moved to the UK, and my husband at the time, who wasn't my husband, decided he wanted to go and work in IT, as you do in London in the heady days. And so I went with him and did a couple of things. I worked for Crime Stoppers in the UK. I also worked for one of the health trusts in the UK on a contract basis for a period of time, which was really interesting. And then I worked for the Conservative Party, which was what I did for the bulk of my time in the UK, in Conservative headquarters, so in the political side of things, not in the government side of things. And I worked for a very prominent shadow minister by the name of Anne Widdecombe. For those of you who have ever been to the UK, you will know of her. And then I worked for William Hague on his election campaign, which didn't succeed, but was a whole heap of fun in getting there. I decided that I was a little bit tired after that experience, so I went to work for the Mobile Operators Association in the UK, which was very focused on the health and safety of mobile phone towers and phones. And so it was a public affairs role, so very much engaged with local, state and federal government in the UK, which again was a really interesting role that I did for a couple of years. I also had my baby over there, and then we decided that we wanted to come home because it was a little bit far away from Australia. So we moved back, and I worked for Senator Kay Patterson in Canberra for a couple of years. It was the end of her time at health, and then going into family and community services. So she was in government, which was an interesting role. I was then lured back to Victoria Police. I found the travel a little bit tough, so I moved back into Victoria Police for another 5 years, where I was the head of media and corporate communications for 5 heady years, and probably well-documented years during Christine Nixon and Simon Overland. So a very sort of challenging period of time in the force's existence, and also, you know, a lot of crisis, a lot of issues. There were the Black Saturday, tragic Black Saturday fires, which was, you know, incredibly challenging, but you know, incredibly interesting period of time to also work through. I then left and moved to Telstra in 2011, which is where I have been ever since. And I think, you know, a fantastic role, and it is a huge company with lots of things happening, and there is never a dull moment. And I think the last thing I would say before handing back, Alistair, is that my career, and probably I'm sure Felicity would say the same, I went where I thought it was going to be most interesting. I never sort of had a grand plan of I've got to be here then and somewhere else some other time. I actually took the opportunities that were in front of me, and I feel like that has set me up well for where I am today.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, two really stellar careers. Yeah, thanks for summarising for everyone. I guess one of the things that's, I guess, the question that gets asked a lot is how transferable skills are between, particularly in comms roles in government and the private sector. Do you think that, I mean, if you've done comms for a department or for a minister, is it easy to just make the switch across? I mean, and likewise, if you've done comms in a private sector, in a big corporate, is it easier to switch across to government?
Felicity, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say that an HR specialist, the best person I've ever worked with, said to me, I always hire executives on change resilience and learning agility. They're the two things we look for, and it's well known around the world. That's what we look for when we look for people who can lead teams and work. And I think it's so true. You should be able to take your skill sets. The skill sets are common around large, complex organizations, leading diverse teams of people, drawing out that diverse thought, having a commercial mindset. It's a complete misunderstanding to suggest that people in the public sector don't have a commercial mindset. Same as reputation management. Reputation management is the same. It may be that you get judged on your revenues more than public perception or delivery, but either or, if you don't plan for them and understand your customer, and everybody has customers, then you won't succeed. So all those skill sets are very similar. All I would say before passing to Nick is the best thing you can do is understand what is the culture you want to work in and for, and also what is it that you're good at that they're really going to value. So if you're really good at issues management and crisis management, which Nick and I will probably both say is one of our stronger offerings as employees, don't go into a company where they jump at their own shadow, because you won't be able to match their anxiety, because you should be there to provide calm in a crisis situation and strategic leadership. And if you're in the wrong company, doesn't matter how good you are, you won't match well, regardless of sector.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I think for me, one of the things that I did when I left Victoria Police is think really carefully about the types of organisations that I wanted to go to. I knew that I really wanted to move into corporate. I'd done a lot of time in government or politics, and I felt that I really wanted to spend some time in corporate. But you know, there was no way that I could go to an organisation that wasn't issues rich, or that didn't tap into, to your point, the strengths that I brought. And so for me, Telstra was the perfect way in some ways, because it is an issues rich company. There's a lot that happens there. It's a huge complex organisation, and so the skills that I'd learned throughout my career I was able to really put to good use at Telstra. I think the one thing that I would say though is, and I agree with your point around the financial acumen, because it's really important. And I did a Masters of Public Administration through Monash and through the government, the state government, and it you know, financial acumen was a critical part of it, and so that is really important. The one thing I would say though is you don't know what you don't know until you get in there. So things like continuous disclosure and reporting of results, which I know obviously in NBN space you do some of that, Felicity, but in a lot of government departments, or certainly in politics, you don't. And so there are some things that you don't know. I think though, as communicators, we're pretty adept at being able to get into an organisation and quickly understand it and get under it and really sort of work with it. But I think you've also just got to give yourself a bit of time to realise there are some things that you need to, you know, understand and learn pretty quickly.
So true.
Yeah. Do either of you have views on when there's a better time in your career to do those sort of transitions between the two? Is it something you can do throughout your career, or is it better to do it once you're more senior or mid-level or entry? Do you think that in the public sector or the private sector typecast you? So you've had a 15-year government career, you've had a 15 years in big corporates. Do you think government's going to look at you and say, oh, they don't really get government? Or you think that the reverse, that they'll say, oh, they don't really get how government works, so we won't give them a shot? Do you think those hurdles exist? And is it better to do it earlier in your career? What do the two of you think?
I think they do exist, and then they're the people you don't want to work for. So Generation Xers like myself, we're sort of brought up on it's your duty to get in front of that person and win that job. And if you win that job, you're super lucky. Actually, the opposite is true. You've got to interview your boss, your company, the culture, make sure it's right for you. And if you don't do that, and look, this came to me later on. I don't think I really understood this until later on in my career so far, is if you don't do that, you're going to feel like a square peg in a round hole. They're going to feel like you're a square peg in a round hole, and it just doesn't do anyone any service. So the minute you sense someone doesn't value your experience or thinks it's doubtful that you'll be able to make it, then you don't want to be there. You want to be somewhere where they're looking at you thinking, wow, diverse experience is really going to add something to my business.
Yeah, it's so true. I must admit, I grew up in an environment where if you had a job, you were lucky and you did everything you could to keep that job, even if it was a horrific job. So that, that was sort of the environment and the time that I was brought up. So it's such a good point. I think, and it's right, the hurdles, I think, they can exist, but Felicity is completely right. You need to pick the right company and make sure it works for you. I mean, I think I funnily enough say quite regularly to my team that people who come from government and political environments into companies that are issues rich have the resiliency into what Felicity mentioned before, the agility to be able to actually adapt really well in corporates. Now that is, that's probably may not be true for all corporates, but it certainly is for the larger ones and those that are sort of issues rich and have the complexity, because the greater your resiliency, the better. And there's nowhere better to get that resiliency than cutting your cloth in government or political type of roles. So I think corporates only benefit from having people from that environment. That would be my view, and I feel pretty strongly about it.
Can I ask you both a controversial question? Is bureaucracy worse in big corporates or in government?
Nick, do you want to go first?
Not sure who should go first. You can go first.
Again, it depends on the company and it depends on the leadership, I think. Bureaucracy is a dirty word, especially in Australia, but actually bureaucracy can save you because sometimes people rush too fast and they can make monumental decisions or actions that have monumental effects. So sometimes bureaucracy isn't always a dirty word, but I've been in private companies and public sector departments where you feel like you're drowning. And so in defence of the private sector, I would say I think UK government, I can say that because I don't think there's anyone on this call that's going to ring the UK government. But when I was in the Home Office, I did feel like I wrote papers, sent them off, and I wasn't entirely sure what happened to them. And so that is debilitating. But likewise, you don't want to work for a cowboy who isn't, or cowgirl who isn't adhering to due process and diligence on behalf of the shareholder, no matter who that is.
Yeah, I think and I agree with you. I mean, I think bureaucracy, and it is, it's not a word that everyone goes, oh, great, well, that's a great thing. It, can be a positive. And I think, one of the things for me that I think is really powerful in government is this sort of the way that they think about planning, the way that they sort of have to really be very robust in their strategy development and their planning. I think that is a real strength in government, certainly that I've seen. And I think there's so many differences in that. If you think about a large corporate like Telstra, when I was in government, when I was in Victoria Police, of course, there was great scrutiny from, customers and from government, and we had FOI and all of those fun things that everybody has to deal with. You replace that with shareholders and investors and customers, and it's just, there's different types of stakeholders that are looking at you and having great expectations about what you're delivering and the way that you're delivering it. And I think, that builds processes and systems in each of those that are there for good reason. And, yes, sometimes it can be harder in some than the others. I mean, I think it absolutely does come down to the leadership team as well. And, I'm lucky I work for a great leadership team that's trying to simplify and get rid of all of the, bureaucracy or the hierarchy and the too many systems and processes. But at the same time, systems and processes mean that organisations work effectively and efficiently. So I think I look at it in a slightly different way.
I think for communicators as well, it's part of our job to identify those systems and processes and make them work for us. So, you can't just rail against things you don't like. You're going to have this in your career the entire time. And actually, I find the most successful people and influencers are those who can identify it and then work within it to their best advantage. And I think that's sort of, if Nick and I think about our teams, they're the people that really drive change because they don't rail against it. They work within it and change to improve in a gradual sense.
Excellent. I just want to shout out to everyone on the call to submit your questions and your questions for us to answer. You can do so by clicking on the little Zoom Q&A box. Before we get to that, I just wanted to ask you if you had any advice that you'd give to someone who was watching this today, thinking either in one role or another, thinking about doing a transition. What advice would you give them?
Well, I would, going back to that point about choosing your employer rather than them choosing you, sounds cheesy, but isn't Marie Kondo's, does it bring me joy? When someone approached me about the NBN job, and you'll laugh, some of you will laugh at this, it brought me immediate joy. I was like, that is the best job I could do in Australia. I feel so lucky that you asked me. I am so excited about this. And they're like, oh, the CEO might change, the government might change, this might change. Everybody thinks I haven't done a great job. They've spent this, they've done this, they've done this. And I was like, exactly. That's why I want to go there. So you've got to choose. You have got to be true to yourself and don't go for a job just because you think other people will be happy or it will look good under your name, because you'll get over that very quickly and you'll forget all about that when you're miserable. So choose something that when they mention it to you or when you see it, you go, oh, if only I could get that job, I would be so excited.
Yeah, it's so... I'm chuckling, Felicity, but it's so true. I think, I look back on my career and the places I've gone, and I've gone because it's like chaos, mayhem, it's all happening. We love it, right? We're comms people. We love all of that. The more chaotic, the better. I think the other thing that I would say to add to that is choose your leaders as well. So really think hard about, depending on what level you're at, about who you're going to be reporting into and what's the values of those of that particular person and what's the leadership style. And I know it sort of sounds a bit corny, but in a sense, how do you fit with it? How do you feel about that? How do you think that that's going to, work for you? And I think it's a really important thing that probably from a comms perspective, and my career, I've not thought about as much, but the more I've got on, that becomes a really critical question for me. Like, how do I feel about that person? Can I work for them? Can I represent them? Can I, communicate or you know, provide them with a strategy and, you know, help them show up publicly in a way that I think is going to work for them and for the organisation. It's a really important part of thinking about your role, because, you know, you spend more time there than you do with your family half the time. So you've got to actually enjoy the people you work with, and also believing in the organisation, but also in the leadership of the organisation. And I think that gives you, as Felicity said before, great joy if you believe in what that organisation is trying to do. So I think it's a really important point. You know, don't be afraid to ask lots of questions about that side of things as well, and work out what matters for you. I mean, the only other thing I'd throw in is, you know, for me in my life right now, flexibility is fantastic. So you can see me sitting here in my office with my dog running around the place, and my daughter will wander by soon. And, you know, that flexibility that I get is really critical. So thinking about what matters to you is really important as well when you're thinking about where to spend your time and where you want to work.
Awesome. We've got a few questions that have come through. I can see two of them are quite similar, so I'll ask them together. First one is, if you're transitioning between public and private sectors, should you expect to transfer at the same level? And the other one is, how do you identify seniority in the corporate world? How does it correlate to government titles and levels?
I think, again, you should focus on the job you're doing rather than the seniority, because depending on the size of the company or the department or the span of responsibility of that role itself, the titles are often not comparable. And I find that even between state government and federal government, and then again, a place like NBN, which is neither. It's not a government department or a corporate. It is a blend of the two. It's a government business enterprise. So you could get hung up on titles and miss a really good opportunity, I would think.
Yeah, and look, titles is really interesting for us because we have we've really done away with titles at Telstra, if that makes sense. And so I'm an executive. I'm not, you know, I'm head of comms, obviously, and externally that's how I'm known, but I'm an executive, and, you know, there's executive and then the sort of, you know, different levels across the organisation, but we don't think like that anymore, and we don't sort of advertise like that anymore. So it does get a bit hard to work it out. And it's, you know, I think you've just got to understand, you know, to Felicity's point, sometimes there are larger organisations. You might, if you're coming straight from government, and I did this when I went from government from VicPol into Telstra. I had a head of comms role at VicPol, and I moved into a deputy head of comms role, if I could sort of describe it loosely as that, at Telstra. Now, some would say, oh, hang on, that's not at the same level, but this was a huge organisation, much bigger than where I'd been. It was a huge team, much bigger than I'd experienced, and it was a very different environment for me, and I needed to, in a sense, cut my cloth first before I was able to sort of, you know, move up through the ranks, so to speak. So it's just understanding the context too, which I think is really important, and asking the questions about, okay, well, where does this fit, and, you know, how does it work, and do I have people reporting to me, don't I, and just trying to sort of get a sense of that as you go through. But I agree. I think these days getting hung up on titles, particularly with corporates that are moving much more towards not having titles as much as, yeah, you might miss something really interesting.
Great feedback. And another attendee's asked, they've spent 7 years contracting in government communications roles, but really keen to move to a full-time role. Is the fact they've only been contracting going to go against them? What do the two of you think?
So I'm a former Commtractor. I think I was one of the founding Commtractors when Commtract started. And it was perfect for me because to Nicole's earlier point, you've got to think about what's going on in your own life as well. Life is never just about work, and you've got to make decisions that are right for you at the right time. And I really needed to take some time to focus on things outside of work, and contracting was the perfect way to do that. I could go in, I was a single operator, I wasn't responsible for other people, I delivered work like a consultant, and I also learned a lot about New South Wales government while I did that. now that ended up being a much bigger job eventually than I'd started with, and I learnt a lot, but no one cared, nor would I care when looking at people's CVs, whether they've been a contractor or not, nor do I care if they've had short stints at places. I just ask them why, and if it's a normal answer, I'm good with that. I think a lot of that has just completely gone.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've people in my team I've got from all walks of life and all different, varieties. And, there's often really good reasons, to your point, why you contract. And to what I was saying before, it could just suit your lifestyle. It's worked for you. You might have had kids through that period of time, and, you've gone on and off in those, you've started jobs, or you've only done shorter stints because of that. I mean, there's so many different reasons that, yeah, I mean, if you're the right person for the role, you're the right person. So I would never, I'd never be worried about that. And quite frankly, if people are worried about that, then go find somewhere else to work.
Exactly. And more and more companies are hiring people on max terms anyway, because of the changing size and scope of their program. And we had a lot of, we went through a phase of hiring a lot of max term comms people here. Now we're more clear about where we're going post the initial build of the network. We can be more concrete. It was never about their capability. It was more about the company's ability to flex.
Yeah, I agree. And we've got lots of contractors. Sorry, Alex.
Sorry, Nick. Felicity, someone just jumped in to say what's max terms. Can you just explain what max terms contract?
Oh, sorry, just a contract. This is a 2-year contract. We're going to give it to you for 2 years.
Fixed term.
Yeah. And I was just going to say that, I mean, I've got lots of people on fixed terms as well. And often it's a piece of work or a project work where it's going to be sort of for a certain period of time, and you bring somebody in to do it. And, they're great talent. And sometimes they stay because there's an opening, and sometimes there's not and they don't. But, that's just life. So.
Look, I'm conscious of the time. I'll just go, there's one more that'll be quick here, I hope, that I can see. It's a bit off topic, but it says, Nick, where did you get the story calendar on your wall? It looks great.
Oh, so I also share an office with my year 12 daughter. Don't start me on year 12 subject, but anyway, I'm happy to, that could be a whole separate session. When I say share the office, she comes in and sort of creates mayhem after she gets home from school, but she stuck that on the wall the other day. She's written absolutely nothing on it, and I suspect that'll be the case until we get to December, so I might start using it. But great question.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions today, but really appreciate the two of you coming on board and sharing